Hello and welcome to all our attendees. Thank you for joining us today. Criterion is very excited to present the second of our two-part series webinar, How to Assess Your CER for MDR Readiness. Part 2, Clinical Data Sources, Risk-Benefit Analysis, and Overall Analyses and Conclusions. Okay, so our first question is, can we use a device, equivalent device for technical and clinical comparison and another device, benchmark device, for biological comparison under MDR?
So I see what we're saying. So this is with regards to the equivalence section of the CER. And if there are multiple devices, like say in a product family, that would need to be included. So I'm going to say a couple of things. If the device and devices that you're establishing equivalence between, they must all be included in that CER. So if I take that second part of that question, which is another device, which is a benchmark device for biological comparison under the MDR, and if I make the assumption that that benchmark device is not included in the CER as part of the product family under evaluation, then in our experience, no. You cannot use that as part of your equivalence. Equivalence is meant to establish equivalence amongst a family of devices, 1, 2, 5, 10, even, that are presented within a CER, and thus all of those devices are going, all of that becomes always, like I like to say, a logic conclusion, which is A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. And then all data can be used on all the devices to establish safety and performance for each device within the CER. I hope that helped. You can always ask your notified body, although they're not very keen on consulting these days, but that might be something you could run by as a strategy with your notified body.
Okay, thanks, Laurie. Next question. In the equivalence pathway process in MDR, if we do not have a contract with the equivalent device manufacturer, how would we get the data from public domain?
I'm going to make this a really simple answer. You don't. The data that is, again, the access to data that you must have, if say you take company X data, you are company Y, but you take company X's device and you want to try to establish that company Y, your device, is thus equivalent to company X's device, and thus use company X's data to establish the safety and performance of your device from company Y, you would need literally their technical file. And you're not going to get that unless you have some sort of relationship with them. And so the level of detail that you would need is, in our experience, and I think the notified body would agree with this, it's simply not possible. You have to use an internal equivalent device, and then you have to establish equivalence with your device, or lacking that, you have to really pursue all sources of clinical data on your own device. So that's a short answer, an oblique answer to this question.
Okay, next question. Can you elaborate on what to do for legacy devices that weren't required to have clinical investigations?
Well, that's a big question right there. Legacy devices that I assume are still under CE mark, and you want to maintain your CE mark under MDR for those legacy devices that weren't required to have clinical investigations. And I take that to mean internal manufacturer held clinical investigations. This is, so using those two assumptions, the elaboration would be, is that this is a very common problem. And it's not really a problem. It's just an approach. You take a different approach in the CER, is that then your data become then it becomes very important for you to establish safety and performance objectives for your competitor device so that you can use those to measure your own devices, what clinical data you do have on your legacy device back to those robust safety and performance outcomes and acceptance criteria. I would use the example of, say, a cardiac guide wire used in a procedure. Nobody does a clinical investigation solely on a guide wire. So I'll just leave this little thought for you. One approach that we've taken many times in a CER is that if a legacy device is part of an overall procedure, it's an integral part of a procedure, such as for a cardiac guide wire, it's an integral part of the procedure of a PCI, percutaneous cardiac intervention, that there is an approach that you can take with regards to performance and safety, is that if the procedure itself was successfully completed, by definition, the component devices used within the procedure were successful and performed as intended. So, and then safety would be any AEs or anything related to the subject device, like the guide wire, kink, or something like that, that would have been reported. So there are ways to go about this that are creative and very well accepted by the notified bodies because they understand this.
All right. Next question is, in the RBA section of the CER, can you include the summary from internal RBA documents?
Well, it depends on what we mean by summary. Summarization of data and results is, and this would be true with every section that has, of the CER, that has internal documentations, PMS, everything else, is that the CER is, think of it as a freestanding document. It exists in its own world, and all data within and all conclusions and analyses that are housed within the CER must be analyzed and written within the construct of the CER and those GSPRs and those outcomes and those safety acceptance criteria. So it is, if this is to mean that there's somewhat of a cut and paste within your internal RBA going over to the summary, into the summary of the CER, be very careful. That will not really fly because it may not be relevant.
All right. Our next question is, are PICO terms mandatory for a state-of-the-art literature search?
So the state-of-the-art literature search, again, to be sure that we're talking about the same thing, is that search I talked about earlier, which is that general references, looking for standards, professional guidelines, and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't use that PICO terms are mandatory. I wouldn't use the word mandatory. I would use the term necessary. Is that the PICO, patient, indication, comparator, and outcomes, those are your good guideposts for search terminology to use to get the type of literature you're looking for in this state-of-the-art literature search. So I would say that PICO terms, identifying relevant PICO terms for this state-of-the-art search is really more relevant than mandatory. I don't think you'll get the results you want if you don't use PICO terms.
Thanks, Laurie. Next question. If you do a pre-market study with a 5-year follow-up period and the approval is granted based on 1-year data, can you then consider the remaining 4-year follow-up period as PMCF?
Oh, I'm not sure. I have to sort through this question. If you do a pre-market study with a 5-year follow-up period and I see. I'm gonna bow out of that question. I think that's a regulatory. We're very careful, as we said at the beginning, that this with regulatory strategy. I want to be. I'm not sure about that, and I would want to be careful about answering that question. So I think that's possible, but it may not be.
All right, we'll jump to the next question. What do you consider the single source of truth for indications for a device?
What do you consider the single source of truth? If that means what document is a single source of truth for the indications of a device, I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I fully capture maybe the nuance of the question. So again, I'm going to level set by saying, if we're talking about the single source of truth for within a company and within the documentation within a company, I've got to always go with the IFU. That's my answer to that question. And if there was something more meant by that question, I apologize if I don't quite understand it. But the single most foundational document for a CER, bar none, is the IFU.
All right. We have just a couple more minutes, so I'm going to squeeze in a few more questions if we can. Are the off-label uses of similar devices, not device, under evaluation reported in the CER?
Similar devices make me think of the state-of-the-art section when you're talking about the maturity of technology. And I also think of similar devices as / competitor devices, in that competitor devices are very similar to your own device with regards to their indications, their use, patient population, technology, design, materials, and so forth. They're not identical to yours, but they exist in that same sort of milieu, if you will, of the technology out there. So they're competitors. So I'm going to take that similar devices. In the state-of-the-art section, we don't approach, because those similar devices are not the devices under evaluation. And the off-label use of those similar devices is not relevant to shouldn't be relevant to your own device under evaluation. So that I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of a reason why we would pursue or contemplate similar devices, which I, again, take to mean competitor devices, and why we would be exploring their the off-label use of a device that is not under evaluation in the CER.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze one last question in. Should there be more than one resource for literature searches?
So I'm going to take one resource might mean one database. And that gets, I think, back to my earlier note about PubMed isn't going to cut it anymore in internet searches. So again, and even there is a shout out, if you look closely in MedDevRev 4, there is a shout out, which really is kind of the underpinning structure of how to approach the writing and organization and structure, if you will, of a CER. As part of that, and when they're talking about step 1, I believe, not step 0, which is scoping, but step 1, the planning of it. And they're talking about when you're planning your literature searches, and they even give a shout out to Embase and Medline. So I would say that Embase and Medline would be minimal. We search also ToxFile and some couple of other common databases.
Well, thank you so much, Laurie. We are out of time, but I think we took as many questions as we could. If we didn't get to your question, we'll definitely get in touch with you afterwards. If you enjoyed this webinar, we presented part 1 of this previously, and you can find the recording for that on our website. We are also following this one with the last in the series called Hidden Traps That Will Derail Your CER. That's taking place next week, so please do join us for that. We're going to talk more about some critical questions you want to address before you start writing. Registration information for the upcoming webinars and the recording and the slides for today's webinar will be emailed to you after we're done. And if you're interested in learning more about the content we've discussed today, or if you just feel ready to avail your free consult for joining us today, go ahead and email us at consult@criterionedge.com, and we'll be happy to get a meeting set up for you. I just want to thank all our attendees again for joining us. Thank you, Laurie, for taking all those wonderful questions. And this ends our webinar broadcast today. So thank you, everybody. Stay safe and take care.